The room is dim, the air thick with the scent of olive oil lamps and nervous sweat. Outside, the harsh Laconian sun beats down. But here, in the cool of a Spartan home, a new life has just begun. A mother, her body exhausted from the ordeal of childbirth, holds her newborn for the first time. For a fleeting moment, there is only the profound, private bond that has connected mothers and children since the dawn of humanity. A tiny hand grips her finger. A fragile cry pierces the silence. But this moment of intimacy is a stolen one. It is a breath held before a plunge into icy water. Because in Sparta, a child is never truly yours. It is a loan from the state, an asset to be evaluated, a component to be inspected. Soon, the father will enter, his face a mask of stoicism. He will not be there to celebrate, but to perform his first duty to this new life, to carry it from the sanctity of the home to the cold, public judgment of the elders. Their destination is the Lesje, a public colonnade where the fate of every Spartan child is decided. There, under the scrutinizing gaze of men who have sent thousands to their deaths, this baby, this bundle of infinite potential, will be unwrapped, measured, and judged. Will it be deemed worthy of joining the most formidable military machine the world has ever known? Or will it be declared a defective part, a liability to be discarded in a place known as the apothetai, the place of rejection? This wasn't a secret ritual performed in shame. It was law. It was duty. It was the foundation of Spartan supremacy. But it was also a poison that corrupted the most fundamental human bonds, turning parents into agents of the state and transforming society into a predator that consumed its own young. Today, we peel back the layers of myth and glory to expose the chilling, systematic process of Spartan child elimination and ask a disturbing question. What happens when a civilization sacrifices its humanity for an ideal of perfection? To understand how a society could normalize the murder of its own children, you must first understand the crushing pressure under which Sparta lived. This wasn't a state born of philosophy and art like its rival, Athens. Sparta was forged in fear and built on a bedrock of institutionalized violence. The defining event in Spartan history was the conquest of their neighbors in Messenia during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The Spartans didn't just defeat the Messenians, they systematically enslaved them, creating a permanent underclass known as the Helots. These Helots were not private slaves, but were owned by the state and assigned to Spartan citizens to work the land. This vast labor force was both the source of Sparta's wealth and its greatest existential threat. By some estimates, the Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by a ratio of 10 to 1. Imagine living in a home surrounded by 10 people you have enslaved, who hate you, and who would kill you and your family at the first sign of weakness. This wasn't a distant threat, it was the daily reality. The constant fear of a Helot uprising became the central organizing principle of Spartan life. It created a siege mentality that never lifted, turning their entire society inward, making it rigid, paranoid, and obsessed with control. This is where the semi-mythical lawgiver, Lycurgus, enters the story. Whether he was a real man or a symbol for generations of gradual reform, the system attributed to him, the Great Retra, was a radical restructuring of society with a single purpose: to subordinate every aspect of human life, family, wealth, emotion, art, to the military needs of the state. Sparta became a machine designed to produce perfect soldiers to suppress the Helots and dominate Greece. The Spartan male was not a citizen who might be called upon to fight. He was a soldier, first and foremost. His life belonged to the state from birth to death, and the state could not afford to waste resources on a soldier who might break. This ideology gave rise to a brutal form of proto-eugenics. The Spartans believed, with religious fervor, that strength, courage, and discipline were heritable traits. Just as a farmer would cull weak livestock to improve the herd, the Spartan state believed it had to cull its own population to maintain its genetic and military purity. The concept of imperfection was therefore dangerously broad. It wasn't just about a visible physical deformity. A child could be condemned for being too small, too sickly, or for having a birthmark that was considered a bad omen. A weak or whimpering cry during the inspection could be interpreted as a lack of the requisite Spartan spirit. In this system, there was no room for compassion, no concept of inherent human worth. A child's value was purely utilitarian. Could it become an effective warrior or the mother of one? If the answer was no, its life was forfeit. The process began moments after birth. The newborn was bathed not just in water, but, according to the historian Plutarch, in wine. The theory was that a strong, healthy infant would react vigorously, while a weak or epileptic child would convulse and perish. While modern scholars question the literal truth of this specific practice, it illustrates the mindset. From the very first hour of life, the child was subjected to a test of its physical fitness. Within days, the father was required by law to present the infant to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. These were men over the age of 60, the hardened survivors of the brutal Spartan ego and decades of warfare. They were not doctors or philosophers. They were the guardians of the Spartan ideal, the living embodiment of the system. Their role was to be the ultimate arbiters of life and death. The examination at the Lesje was a cold, clinical, and public affair. The father would hand over his child. The swaddling clothes would be removed, leaving the infant naked and vulnerable before the council. The elders would pass the baby from one to another, their calloused hands probing its limbs, checking the straightness of its spine, the shape of its head. They would observe its breathing, its skin tone, its reactions. They were searching for any sign of softness or deviation from the ideal form. There was no formal checklist, no scientific standard. The judgment was entirely subjective, based on the cultural prejudices and hardened life experiences of these old warriors. A child could be condemned on a whim because an elder disliked the look in its eyes, or because its family had fallen out of political favor. There was no appeal. The decision of the Gerousia was absolute. If the child passed, it was returned to its parents to be raised for a time. But it was now officially a ward of the state. If it was condemned, the father was expected to show no emotion. To grieve for a child deemed unworthy was to show weakness, to question the wisdom of the state. It was an act of disloyalty. The mother, waiting at home, would be informed of the verdict. She, too, was expected to accept it with stoic pride, celebrating that she had not burdened Sparta with a defective citizen. This forced suppression of natural love and grief was a form of psychological warfare waged by the state against its own people, severing the bonds of family to reinforce the primacy of the state. For the children who were condemned, their fate was sealed. The most famous destination, seared into the popular imagination, is the Apothetai, a deep chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. Ancient writers like Plutarch paint a grim picture of these infants being tossed into the ravine, their short lives ending violently on the rocks below. It's a powerful and horrifying image that has defined our perception of Sparta for centuries. But is it true? This is where the work of the modern historian and archaeologist becomes crucial. For decades, the story of the Apothetai was taken as fact. However, archaeological excavations at the site have yielded a surprising result. The human remains found within the chasm are not those of infants. Instead, they belong primarily to adolescents and adults, men aged between 18 and 35. This discovery has forced a major reevaluation of the ancient texts. It seems the Apothetai was a place of execution, but for criminals, traitors, and perhaps prisoners of war, not for newborns. So, what really happened to Sparta's rejected children? The most likely answer is a practice common throughout the ancient world, but systematized by the Spartans: exposure. Instead of a quick death in the chasm, the condemned infant was taken to a desolate spot in the wilderness and simply left to die. It was a slower, and arguably more cruel, fate. The child would succumb to the elements, the freezing cold of the night or the blistering heat of the day, or be taken by wild animals. This method served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it absolved the community of the direct act of murder. Their hands were clean. It was nature, or the gods, that ultimately claimed the child. On a psychological level, it was the ultimate act of rejection. The child was not even worthy of a quick death. It was erased from the community, left to vanish without a trace, its existence denied. This quiet, lonely end stands in stark contrast to the dramatic imagery of the cliff, but it is a deeper and more insidious kind of horror. History records the laws and the battles, but it rarely records the names of the victims of such systems. To understand the true human cost, we must reconstruct their stories from the fragments of evidence and the logic of the society that condemned them. Lyra was born to a family of middling rank. Her father, Damon, was a respected soldier, not of the elite, but a solid contributor to the phalanx. At her inspection, Lyra was deemed perfect. Strong, healthy, loud. She was returned to her parents, and for 7 years, she was raised as a Spartan girl should be. But around the time of her 8th birthday, something changed. She began to have seizures, what the ancients would have seen as a sacred disease, a sign of divine affliction. She was no longer perfect. She could not be counted on to produce strong sons. Her condition was a stain on her family's bloodline. The state did not formally execute children who developed flaws later in life, but it had other methods. Lyra was ostracized. Her family was shamed. Her prospects for marriage vanished. She became a living ghost in her own society, a constant reminder of imperfection. Her father, Damon, who had once held her with pride, could no longer look at her without seeing a failure, not hers, but his. The system didn't need to kill her. It had stripped her of her life's purpose and her family of its honor, a punishment that lasted a lifetime. They were twins, born to a mother from a prestigious bloodline. From the moment of birth, the difference was clear. Nikos was robust and cried with a startling strength. Arion was smaller, quieter, and had a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand. Their mother knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that one would pass inspection and one would not. The law required the father to present the infant. But which one? To present both was to invite the condemnation of Arion and bring shame for producing a flawed child. Could they hide one? Impossible. Neighbors were informants, and the state's reach was absolute. The family made a horrific choice. They would present Nikos, the perfect son. He was taken to the Lesje and, as expected, was praised by the elders for his strength. He was Sparta's future. And Arion? He disappeared. There was no record, no ceremony. He was likely exposed that same night by his own father, who had to erase the evidence of his family's failure. The mother was left to raise one son, Nikos, while mourning the other in secret. How could she look at her perfect child without seeing the ghost of his brother? The system had not just taken a child. It had forced parents into an act of unimaginable cruelty and hollowed out their family from the inside, leaving a wound that could never be spoken of and would never heal. For centuries, the Spartan system seemed to work. They produced the most feared soldiers in Greece. Their victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War cemented their reputation as an unstoppable force. They were admired, feared, and even emulated by others who saw their discipline as the key to success. But their system was a poison well. The very practices that made them strong in the short term were sowing the seeds of their destruction. The relentless culling of their own population had a predictable, catastrophic consequence: demographic collapse. The number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, began to shrink alarmingly. This condition, known to the ancient Greeks as oliganthropia, a scarcity of men, meant that Sparta could field smaller and smaller armies. They were purifying their bloodline into extinction. Each generation had fewer, perfect children than the last. By the 4th century BC, the number of Spartiates had dwindled to a dangerously low level. Furthermore, their society had become pathologically rigid. The Agoge produced perfect hoplite soldiers, but it stifled innovation, creativity, and critical thinking. When military tactics began to evolve, as they did with the Theban general Epaminondas and his use of the sacred band, the Spartans were unable to adapt. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. The Thebans crushed their army, and Sparta, with its depleted population, could not recover. The system, designed for ultimate survival, had made them brittle. When the pressure changed, they didn't bend, they broke. In the aftermath of their collapse, the historical whitewashing began. Later Greek and Roman writers, fascinated by Sparta's discipline, often downplayed the most brutal aspects of the regime. They romanticized the Agoge and presented the elimination of infants as a rational, if harsh, measure of statecraft. This romanticized image has persisted for millennia, culminating in modern pop culture depictions like the movie 300, which portrays the Spartans as noble heroes fighting for freedom. This narrative conveniently ignores the foundation of their society, the brutal enslavement of the Helots and the systematic killing of their own children. The Spartans were not fighting for freedom in any universal sense. They were fighting to preserve a rigid, oppressive system that depended on violence, both external and internal, to survive. Let us return, one last time, to that Spartan mother in the dim room, holding her newborn child. The entire weight of her society, its history, its fears, and its laws, pressed down on that one fragile moment. The choice she faced was not a choice at all. It was a mandate. Suppress your love, surrender your child, and serve the state. The Spartan system of child elimination represents one of history's most chilling examples of a society's pursuit of a theoretical ideal at the expense of its own humanity. They sought to create the perfect soldier, and in doing so, they created a state that was incapable of nurturing, adapting, or ultimately surviving. The thousands of infant bones that were scattered in the Laconian wilderness are a testament to this failure. Their deaths did not make Sparta stronger. They hollowed out its soul and drained it of its future. The story of Sparta is a dark mirror. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that echo through the ages. How does a society define the worth of a life? What happens when we begin to value people based on their perceived utility or their adherence to a prescribed ideal? The logic of the Spartan Gerousia, the cold calculus that weighs a human life and finds it wanting, has not vanished from the world. The silent, unseen graves of those children are a permanent warning. They remind us that the pursuit of an abstract perfection can lead to concrete monstrosities. They tell us that the true strength of a civilization lies not in its ability to eliminate weakness, but in its capacity for compassion, its embrace of diversity, and its unwavering belief in the inherent worth of every single human life. The moment we forget that, we take a step toward the chasm. If you believe these forgotten stories from the dark corners of history need to be told, please consider subscribing to Dark Ages Historian and sharing this video. Our past is filled with complex and often uncomfortable truths, and only by confronting them can we hope to understand ourselves. Click the video on your screen now for our next investigation into the brutal realities of the Viking berserkers. Thank you for joining us on this journey.